The day Rose Maddox rode into Redemption Creek, Texas, the summer of 1878, she did so with a Winchester rifle laid across her saddle horn and a look on her face that made grown men step off the boardwalk to let her pass. Nobody in Redemption Creek knew her name yet. They only knew the look. It was the kind of look that had been carved by years of hard living, the way wind carves canyons, slowly, methodically, without mercy. Her jaw was set like stone, her dark eyes scanning the street with the practiced wariness of a woman who had learned the hard way that the world offered nothing freely. She wore a faded blue dress beneath a heavy canvas coat, her brown hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck, and she sat in the saddle with the posture of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be at ease. She was 26 years old, though she looked older, not in the way of illness or neglect, but in the way of someone who had been carrying something impossibly heavy for a very long time. She tied her horse, a sturdy gray mare she called Pepper, to the post outside the general store, stepped inside, and set a list of supplies on the counter without a word of greeting. The proprietor, a round-faced man named Hector Birch, blinked at the list and then at the woman, and decided immediately that he would not ask her any questions he did not need answers to. "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. "I'll have this ready in about an hour." "I'll be back," she said, and walked out. That was how Redemption Creek first met Rose Maddox. The town itself was the kind of place that had grown up fast along a cattle route and was still trying to decide what it wanted to be. There was a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolroom during the week, a blacksmith shop, a small but sturdy jailhouse, and perhaps 40 permanent residents scattered between the main street and the surrounding homesteads. The Texas Hill Country rolled away in every direction, all limestone bluffs and cedar thickets, and the occasional silver thread of a creek cutting through dry grass. It was beautiful country, if you were the kind of person who still noticed beauty. Rose was not, at the moment, that kind of person. She had come to Redemption Creek because she had purchased, sight unseen and through correspondence with a land agent in San Antonio, a small homestead on the eastern edge of town. 40 acres. A house that the agent had described as sturdy and well-appointed, a description that Rose had taken with considerable salt, having dealt with land agents before. She had saved every dollar she had earned over the previous 3 years working as a cook at a cattle ranch outside of Abilene, had sold the small plot of land her mother had left her when she died, and had used every penny of it to buy a place that was entirely her own. She had no husband. She had no family to speak of. She wanted neither. She found the homestead at the end of a wagon track that wound through a stand of live oaks, and she stood in front of it for a long moment, taking inventory. The house was a single-story structure of rough-cut limestone, solid enough in its bones but in need of work, a sagging shutter, a front step that had cracked clean through, a chimney that would need to be repointed before winter. The barn was small but sound. The well had a proper cover. There was a kitchen garden that had been left to go wild, but the soil looked rich beneath the weeds. Rose walked through it all with the same expression she had worn into town, noting everything that needed doing, calculating how long it would take and what it would cost. She did not feel joy at having her own place, not exactly, but she felt something, a quiet, cautious thing that she pressed back down before she had time to identify it, because she had learned a long time ago that feeling hopeful was the first step toward being hurt. She set her bedroll on the floor of the main room, lit a fire in the hearth, ate cold biscuits she had carried from Abilene, and slept. Albert Crawford came into the story the way most good things came into Rose's life, uninvited, and at an inconvenient moment. She had been on her property for 4 days when she woke just before dawn to the sound of cattle, moving along the track that ran along the northern fence line of her land. She was outside with her Winchester before the sleep had fully cleared from her eyes, and she found Albert Crawford sitting on a big roan horse at her fence, trying to ease his small herd of a dozen cattle past the gap where 2 rails had come down in the night. He was 32 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who worked outdoors, with dark hair that curled at the collar and eyes the color of creek water in shade, a gray-green that shifted depending on the light. He wore a battered felt hat and a canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he was in the middle of attempting to coax a particularly stubborn steer back from the gap in her fence when he looked up and found himself looking down the barrel of a Winchester. He went very still. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I am not here to cause you any trouble. Your fence came down in the night, and my cattle are trying to wander onto your property." "Your cattle," Rose said flatly. "Yes, ma'am, my spread borders yours to the north. Name's Albert Crawford. I own the Running Sea brand." He kept his hands very visible and his voice very steady. "I was trying to push them back before they got onto your land." Rose looked past him at the cattle. She looked at the fence. She lowered the rifle, though she did not set it aside. "Your cattle broke my fence." "I don't believe they did," Albert said, still carefully. "That section has been down since before you arrived. I noticed it a few days ago. I was going to ride over and offer to help fix it, but I didn't want to presume." There was a pause, a long one. A mockingbird started up somewhere in the oaks. "You were going to offer to help fix it," Rose repeated, her tone making it clear that she found this suspicious. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Albert blinked. It was an honest question plainly asked, and it surprised him. "Because you're my neighbor," he said, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "I can fix my own fence," Rose said. "I don't doubt it," he said, "but it's easier with two." Another silence. The steer that had been nosing toward the gap gave a long, mournful sound and turned itself back toward the rest of the herd. "Move your cattle along," Rose said. "I'll deal with the fence myself." Albert Crawford looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am. Welcome to Redemption Creek." He turned his horse and began pushing his cattle north along the track. Rose watched him go. Then she went inside and made coffee and thought about the fence and told herself she was not thinking about him. She fixed the fence herself. It took most of the morning, and she split her palm on a nail, and she thought while she worked about what it meant to be entirely on her own in a new place at 26 years old, and she found that the thoughts, on balance, were acceptable. She had been alone before. She knew how to be alone. It was company that had always cost her more than she could afford. The story of how Rose Maddox had come to wear that expression, the one that made men step off the boardwalk, was not a simple one, but it was common enough in the West of 1878 that a person who knew the territory would have recognized the shape of it even without the details. She had been born in Missouri. Her father had been a kind man who died of fever when she was 9. Her mother had worked hard and raised Rose and her younger brother Thomas, as well as any woman alone could manage. Rose had been 17 when she married Daniel Maddox, which was not an unusual age for a girl in rural Missouri in 1869, and she had married him partly because she was fond of him, and partly because it seemed like the thing to do, the practical shape that a life was supposed to take. They had gone west together, following the promise of cheap land and a fresh start, the same promise that had lured thousands of others out across the plains. They had settled in Kansas. Daniel had worked hard. Rose had worked harder. They had built something together that was small but real: a house, a kitchen garden, a few pigs, a mule named Governor. She had been happy, she thought, or at least she had been content, which at the time had seemed like the same thing. Then came the winter of 1873 and a sickness that moved through the county like a slow fire. Daniel was dead by February. Rose's brother Thomas, who had come to stay with them the previous autumn, was dead by March. Her mother, back in Missouri, had died the following summer. Rose had buried them all, one after another, and she had felt each loss like a stone being added to a weight she carried on her chest. By the time the last grief had settled, she had decided, without quite putting it into words, that she would not let herself be that open again. That she would not give anything she could not afford to lose. That the careful, guarded life was the only reasonable one. She had sold the Kansas homestead and spent the next several years moving through various jobs: cook, laundress, seamstress, working and saving and keeping her own counsel. She was not cruel. She was not unkind. She was simply encased, the way a fruit will form a hard skin in dry weather to protect whatever softness remains inside. She had been so encased for so long that she had, by the time she rode into Redemption Creek, almost entirely forgotten what she had been protecting. In the weeks that followed, Albert Crawford proved to be a particular kind of neighbor, persistent without being pushy, helpful without being overbearing, and consistently failing to be discouraged by the reception Rose gave him. He did not come over uninvited again after that first morning, but he had a habit of being in the right place at the right time, which Rose suspected was not entirely accidental. When she brought Pepper into town to be reshod and found herself at an impasse with the blacksmith, Tom Hensley, over what was a fair price for the work, Albert appeared at the forge entrance and quietly suggested that Hensley reconsider, with the air of a man who did not need to raise his voice to be taken seriously. Hensley reconsidered. When Rose went to the general store to settle her account and discovered that someone had apparently already paid for a sack of flour and a tin of coffee that she had ordered the previous week, Hector Birch looked at the ceiling when she asked who had done it. "Someone who didn't want a fuss made," Hector said diplomatically. Rose had left the store with her teeth set. She had found Albert Crawford at the water trough outside the saloon, and she had told him in no uncertain terms that she was not a charity case and that she was perfectly capable of paying for her own supplies, and that he should spend his money on his own concerns. Albert had listened to all of this with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a slow circle. When she finished, he said, "You're right, and I apologize. It won't happen again." He had said it so simply, without defensiveness or wounded pride, that Rose had not known what to do with it. She had walked back to Pepper and ridden home and spent the evening thinking about the strange quality of a man who could be corrected and not crumble or combust. Daniel had not been bad, but he had been sensitive to criticism, and Rose had learned to manage around it. The men at the cattle ranch in Abilene had been decent enough most of the time, but they had been the sort who took any directness from a woman as a personal affront. Albert Crawford seemed to belong to some different category that Rose did not yet have a name for. The summer heat settled over Redemption Creek like a wool blanket, and Rose worked her land. She planted a kitchen garden. She repaired the chimney with mortar she mixed herself. She replaced the broken front step with a flat slab of limestone she dragged up from the creek bed on a wooden sledge. She acquired 2 chickens from a woman in town named Mabel Greer, and then a 3rd chicken, and then a goat that she named Sergeant because he seemed to feel he was in charge of everything. She established a routine that was hard and satisfying and kept her from thinking too much about the past. One morning in late July, she looked up from weeding her garden to find Albert Crawford standing at her gate, not on his horse this time but on foot, holding his hat and looking as though he was aware that he might not be welcome. "I have a proposition," he said when she looked at him. "And before I say it, I want to be clear that it is a business proposition and not anything else, because I have a feeling you are thinking that already." Rose sat back on her heels. "Say your piece, Mr. Crawford." "I have a problem," he said, setting his hat on top of the fence post and folding his arms across it, as though settling in for a conversation. "The man I had cooking for my ranch hands quit last month and went to Fort Worth. I have 4 men to feed 3 times a day, and none of them can cook worth a damn, including me. I know you worked as a cook in Abilene. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to come over 3 days a week and cook the noon and evening meals. I would pay you fairly. You could set the price." Rose considered this for a moment. "You have 4 ranch hands." "Yes." "Are they respectful?" Albert looked at her steadily. "They will be," he said, "or they'll be looking for work elsewhere." The flatness of it, the absolute certainty, was something Rose noticed and filed away. 3 days a week," she said. "Or 2 if that suits better. You set the terms." She thought about the small reserve of money she had set aside and how quickly it would dwindle if she could not supplement it before winter. She thought about the work which she was good at and which she did not mind. She thought about the independence she would preserve by earning her own money rather than depending on savings. 3 days, she said. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I'll set the price after the first week once I know what I'm working with. Agreed, Albert said and picked his hat off the post and put it on. Rose stood up and dusted the soil from her knees. I'll come Monday. Thank you, Miss Maddox. He said it without any of the patronizing warmth that she had come to dread from men who thought they were doing her a favor. He said it the way he would say it to any person with whom he had just reached a fair agreement. She almost said, "You're welcome," and then stopped herself and just nodded. He walked back up the track toward his property, and she watched him go and then turned back to her weeding. The running sea spread was larger than Rose had expected. Albert kept a herd of about 300 cattle, which he ran on a mix of his own land and leased grazing land to the north. And he employed 4 hands, a Mexican man named Ernesto, who had been there the longest, 2 brothers from Tennessee named Wallace and Carl Holt, and a young man barely out of boyhood named Pete Sutter who had shown up at the gate one spring morning asking for work, and who Albert had hired because, as he said privately, the boy had been hungry enough that he could see it in the way Pete held himself. The ranch kitchen was a separate structure behind the main house, with a large wood-burning stove and enough equipment to cook for 10. Rose arrived on the first Monday and took inventory of what was in the larder, made a list of what was needed, and set to work. By noon she had produced a meal of salt pork, beans, cornbread, and stewed tomatoes that made even Ernesto, who rarely said anything he did not absolutely have to say, look up from his plate and nod once in solemn approval. Albert ate at the same table as his men, which surprised Rose. She had cooked for a rancher in Abilene who ate separately, in the house, as if sitting with the hired hands might be contagious. Albert Crawford sat at the end of the long table and ate what everyone else ate and said very little, but he listened. And occasionally he said something dry and understated that made the men laugh, and Rose, carrying dishes back and forth, found herself noticing the way his face changed when he laughed, the lines around his eyes, the way the guardedness left him briefly. She caught herself noticing it and looked away and focused on the dishes. After the noon meal, as the men went back to their work, Albert poured himself a second cup of coffee and offered the pot to Rose, who was cleaning the stove. She almost refused because that was her reflex, and then she thought about the fact that she had been on her feet since 5 in the morning and that there was no good reason to refuse coffee, and she took a cup and sat down at the cleared table. Albert sat across from her, not across as indirectly across in the way that might feel like a confrontation, but across and slightly to the side, the way a person sits when they are not trying to make a point of the proximity. "Good meal," he said. "The men will work better this afternoon." "Food does that," Rose said. A comfortable silence settled. Outside they could hear Ernesto calling something in Spanish to one of the Holt brothers and a horse blowing in the corral. "How are you settling in?" Albert asked. It was not the kind of question that demanded a detailed answer. It was the kind a neighbor asks, an offering of conversation rather than a demand for it. "Fine," Rose said. Then, because he had asked and because the question had been genuine, she added, "The chimney was worse than it looked, but it's right now." "You did it yourself?" "I did." He nodded, and Rose waited for the thing that men usually said after a statement like that, the half-admiring, half-doubting comment about how she must have found it difficult or how she should have asked for help, or the suggestion that she was too proud. Albert Crawford said none of those things. He just nodded, as though it were simply information. "I need to repoint the chimney on the main house before fall," he said, looking down at his coffee. "Never seemed to get to it." "It's not difficult once you've mixed the mortar right," Rose said. "What's the ratio?" She looked at him, and he was looking at his coffee, asking an honest question, and she felt something shift very slightly, not much, not dramatically, just a small fraction of a degree, the way a compass needle trembles when something magnetic passes close. 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, she said. "You have to keep it from drying too fast in the heat." "I'll remember that," he said. They finished their coffee and Rose went back to the stove, and Albert put on his hat and went back to his cattle, and neither of them made anything of it. The weeks passed, and the routine established itself the way good routines do, without drama, simply by repeating and deepening. 3 days a week, Rose walked the half-mile between her property and Albert's, and cooked for the running sea. She learned the preferences of the men without being told. Ernesto's love of anything with peppers, Wallace's inability to tolerate anything too spicy, Carl's sweet tooth, Pete's tendency to eat everything in front of him as fast as possible, as if afraid someone might take it. She learned where Albert kept things, which cupboards held what, how the stove ran hot on the right side, where the good knife was hidden at the back of the drawer. She did not learn these things in order to become comfortable. She learned them because she was thorough, and because doing a job well was a habit she refused to abandon. But she noticed, all the same, that she was not uncomfortable. On a Friday in August, a hard thunderstorm rolled in off the plains in the middle of the afternoon and trapped Rose in the ranch kitchen when it was too violent to walk home in. She stood at the kitchen doorway and watched the rain come down in gray sheets, and was composing herself to simply walk through it. She had been wet before. It would not kill her. When Albert appeared from the barn at a run, his hat pulled low and his coat soaked through, and stopped at the kitchen doorway. "Don't," he said simply, reading her intention from her posture. "It will pass," Rose said, "or it won't for another 3 hours. This kind of storm has a way of sitting." He ran a hand over his face to clear the water. "Stay and have supper with us. There's no sense in you walking home soaked through and then having a cold chimney to deal with." Rose looked at the rain. She looked at him. She looked at the rain again. "I already prepared a meal," she said, which was not a yes and not a no, but was a movement in a particular direction. "Then let's eat it while it's hot," Albert said. She ate supper with Albert and his men that evening, sitting at the long table as a guest rather than as the cook, and it was strange and not unpleasant. Ernesto told a long story about a cattle drive he had been on in 1871 that involved a flooded river, a runaway remuda, and a cook who had spent most of the crisis sitting on top of the chuck wagon singing hymns. Wallace and Carl argued good-naturedly about which of them had been first to pull the cook down from the wagon. Pete ate 3 helpings of the stew Rose had made and looked profoundly content. Albert listened to all of it with that expression he had, attentive, faintly amused, unhurried, and once or twice he caught Rose's eye across the table, not with any particular meaning, just the way two people will meet each other's gaze when they are both watching the same thing happen. Rose looked away each time, but each time she looked away a little more slowly. The storm passed by 9 o'clock, and Albert rode with her to her gate on the gray, rain-washed evening, the creek running full and musical in the cedar breaks. He did not offer to escort her because she needed it, but because the road was dark and the ground was uncertain, and Rose understood the difference. He waited at the gate while she went inside and lit a lamp, and when the light showed in the window, he turned his horse and rode back, and Rose stood by the window and watched him go and told herself she was watching to make sure he got back safely, because the road was dark and the ground was uncertain. Summer burned down into a golden autumn, and Redemption Creek settled into its fall rhythms. The cattle drives had wound down and the town was quieter. The mornings came cold and the afternoons warm, and the live oaks turned a dusty bronze along the hillsides. On a Wednesday in late September, Rose arrived at the running sea to find the yard in a state of controlled activity that suggested something was happening. Albert and Ernesto were in the corral with a horse Rose had not seen before, a young bay that was clearly giving them considerable trouble, moving in tight, panicked circles and refusing to be approached. Rose set her things in the kitchen and came to the fence. Pete was leaning on the rails nearby, watching. "Where did that come from?" Rose asked him. "Mr. Crawford bought her off a man passing through 2 days ago," Pete said. "Man had a string of horses he said were gentled, but she hasn't been anything like gentled. She's been scared of everything and won't eat right and won't let anybody near her." Rose watched the horse for a moment. The The bay was not vicious. She could see that there was no pinning of ears, no teeth. There was only fear, the wide-eyed, rolling kind that came from something that had been handled wrong at some point and had not forgotten it. She was mishandled, Rose said. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Crawford thinks so too. He's been patient with her, but she hasn't come around any. Rose was quiet for another moment. Then she opened the corral gate and stepped inside. Albert looked up quickly. Miss Maddox, I know horses, Rose said. Stand back, please. There was a pause, and then Albert stepped back, and Ernesto stepped back, and both of them went very still in the way of men who recognized something in someone else's manner and knew enough to let it happen. Rose did not approach the bay. She stood in the corral at a point that was not quite near and not quite far, and she did not look directly at the horse. She looked at the ground just off to the side. She stood there and breathed slowly and let the horse know she was there and that she was not going to do anything sudden. The bay watched her with those wide, frightened eyes. Her nostrils worked, reading the air. Rose waited. 2 minutes passed. 3. The bay's circling slowed. She stopped and turned to look at Rose fully, ears forward now instead of flattened, still alert but moving from fear into curiosity. Rose moved slightly. Not toward the horse, but just a shift of her weight, letting herself be seen fully. She held out one hand, palm up, empty. The bay stretched her neck forward. Rose did not move. The horse stretched further. She touched her nose to Rose's palm, a quick, tentative touch, and then jerked back. Rose kept her hand out. The bay came forward again, this time slower, and stayed and blew a long breath against Rose's palm. There, Rose said quietly. Nobody here to hurt you. She heard a sound from outside the corral and looked over her shoulder. Albert was leaning on the fence with his arms on the top rail and his hat pushed back on his head, watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not admiration exactly, but something more careful than that, something that looked like recognition, like a man who has been looking at something out of the corner of his eye for a long time and has finally turned to look at it directly. Rose looked at him, and for once did not immediately look away. She just needed someone to be still with her, Rose said. Albert's expression did not change much, but something behind his eyes did. I can see that, he said. Rose turned back to the horse and scratched the bay gently behind the ear. The bay leaned into it. She came home that evening and sat on the front step of her limestone house in the cooling October air and thought about that look and what it meant. And she pressed it down, the way she had been pressing things down for years. But it was harder to press down than it used to be, and she noticed that too. It was Mabel Greer who said it out loud first. Mabel was one of the few women in Redemption Creek who had managed to get past Rose's manner into something that approached friendship, mostly because Mabel was forthright to the point of being startling, and seemed to find Rose's guardedness more interesting than off-putting. Mabel ran a small dressmaking operation out of her home and had a gift for knowing things about people, which she dispensed without malice, but also without much filter. They were sitting in Mabel's parlor on a Saturday in October, Rose having come into town for supplies and having been pulled in for coffee with the particular insistence that Mabel applied to everything. They were talking about the coming winter, and about the new preacher who had arrived at the church, and about whether the Holt brothers had finally settled their long-standing dispute about a horse race back in Tennessee, which they had apparently still not resolved. Albert Crawford asked Carl Holt about you yesterday, Mabel said, refilling the coffee cups as easily as if she were discussing the weather. Rose looked at her. What do you mean, asked about me? Asked how you were getting on with your place. Whether you seemed to be managing all right through the season. Mabel sat back and stirred her coffee with the same casual air. He has been asking about you, here and there. Very quietly, very discreetly. I see him 3 days a week, Rose said. He could ask me directly. He probably could, Mabel agreed, but I think Albert Crawford is a careful man. Rose looked at her coffee cup. There's nothing there, Mabel. Mabel made a sound that was not quite a word. I mean it, Rose said. I cook for the man's hands, that's the arrangement. Of course, Mabel said pleasantly. And how many times has he made sure your path home was safe, or seen to it that you had what you needed before you knew you needed it, entirely as part of that arrangement? He's a decent neighbor. He is, Mabel said. He is a very decent neighbor. She paused. He hasn't courted anyone in 4 years, not since his wife passed. Rose was quiet for a moment. I didn't know he had been married. Albert Crawford, Mabel said more gently now. She died in childbirth in '74, the baby as well. He took it very hard. The first year he has come back from it mostly. But he has not let himself go forward either. She looked at Rose over her coffee cup. You have something in common. Rose set her cup down carefully. That's not the same thing. No, Mabel agreed. It's not the same, but it's similar enough to recognize. Rose walked home that afternoon along the road that passed Albert Crawford's gate, and she looked at the running sea as she passed it, at the smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney, at the horses in the corral that included now the bay, who was eating contentedly from a hay rack near the fence. And she thought about Albert Crawford and a baby who had not lived, and she thought about Daniel and Thomas and her mother, and she thought about the particular weight of grief and what it did to a person's capacity for trust. She thought about a man who had not pressed, who had not demanded, who had offered help and then stepped back and waited. She thought about how long it had been since she had let herself truly look at anything. She went home and made supper and sat by the fire and read from the Bible her mother had given her, which she did not read for religion particularly, but for the comfort of a familiar voice. And she let the thoughts move through her without pushing them down for once, and she noticed that the world did not end because she had thought them. The first freeze of the year came in November, and with it, a problem. Rose's root cellar, which she had worked hard to stock through the fall, had a crack in the back wall that she had not discovered until the first hard frost, when water seeping in from the hillside began to freeze and expand the crack, threatening the entire back section of the wall. She discovered it early on a Tuesday morning and spent 2 hours in the dim, cold space trying to assess it, and concluded that it needed a full stone and mortar repair that she could not do alone. The stones in the lower course of the wall were simply too heavy to maneuver without a second set of hands. She stood in the cold and looked at the cellar door for a long time, and then she walked to Albert Crawford's gate. She found him at the corral, saddling the roan for the morning, and she walked up to the fence and said, without any preamble, I have a problem with my root cellar and I need help with it. I would like to hire you for a half-day's work. I'll pay you in meals for the week. Albert looked at her for a moment. He had learned in the past months not to smile at her in the way that would close her down, but something changed very slightly in his eyes. I'll come now if you need, he said. After you've done your morning rounds, she said, because she would not be an imposition. My rounds can wait, he said. They worked together in the cold dimness of the root cellar for most of the morning, Albert handling the heavy stones that Rose directed, Rose mixing mortar and applying it with the precision of someone who had done it before. The work was quiet and companionable in the way that shared physical labor can be, 2 people focused on the same problem, falling into a rhythm, learning each other's movements. At one point, Albert was holding a large stone against the wall at an awkward angle while Rose mortared the course beneath it, and his arm was shaking with the effort of holding it steady, and Rose said, 2 minutes, and worked faster without being asked, and the stone went into place. Thank you, Albert said, flexing his arm. You held it, Rose said. You worked fast. We both did, she said, and then was briefly surprised by the way it had come out naturally, the way it fit. They ate lunch at Rose's kitchen table. She had made a pot of soup that morning in anticipation of a cold day's work, and it was the first time Albert Crawford had been inside her house. He looked around with the respectful, appreciative attention of someone who recognizes the mark of careful effort in a space. The stone walls were hung with a few simple things, a piece of blue cloth, a calendar, the Bible shelf. The table was clean pine, the chairs solid and plain. You've made it a real home, he said. It's mine, Rose said simply, and then heard the weight of what she had said, all that the word mine carried for a woman who had worked for 3 years to have something wholly her own. Albert heard it too. He looked at her not with pity, which she could not have borne, but with something more like understanding, as though the word had landed somewhere in him that had a corresponding echo. "I know what that means," he said quietly. She believed him. After he left that afternoon, Rose sat at her kitchen table in the winter light and thought for a very long time. She thought about what Mabel had told her. She thought about Albert Crawford and about Daniel. She thought about the root cellar and the we and the word mine, and the look in Albert's eyes at the corral fence when she had gentled the bay horse. She thought about how long it had been since she had let anyone near enough to matter, and how strange it was that she had not noticed until now quite how near he had been getting, not through pressure or pursuit, but simply through consistency and patience and the unglamorous business of being reliable, day after day, without demanding anything in return. She was afraid. The fear was real, and she did not dismiss it, because it was the reasonable fear of someone who had lost people and knew what loss felt like, knew the exact weight and texture of it, and was not eager to be that open to it again. But she was also, she realized, sitting there in the winter light, tired. Tired of the weight she carried, tired of the hardness she maintained, the constant effort of it. She had worn it so long she had half forgotten that it was something she was wearing and not something she simply was. She had half forgotten the woman underneath who had laughed easily once, who had loved Daniel with a young woman's full, unguarded heart, who had run barefoot in a Missouri summer when she was 12 years old and felt the world as a place full of possibility. That woman was not dead. She was just buried under years of careful protection. Rose Maddox sat in her kitchen in the November light of 1878 and felt, for the first time in years, the exact weight of what she had been carrying, and began for the first time to ask herself whether she still needed to carry it. The next Friday she arrived at the Running Sea at her usual time, and when the noon meal was done and the men had gone back to work and Albert poured coffee the way he always did, she sat down at the table and did not immediately go back to the dishes. Albert looked at her as he set the cups down, reading the difference in her posture, and sat in his usual place. "I want to say something," Rose said, "and I want to say it plainly because I don't know another way." "All right," Albert said. "I don't know how to do this easily," she said. "I don't know how to be easy with people. I haven't been for a long time. I know you've noticed, and I want you to know that it's not about you. It was like that before you." Albert was quiet, listening with that quality he had of giving his complete attention without requiring anything in return. "I also want to say," Rose continued, keeping her eyes on the table between her hands, "that I have noticed what you do. The fence and the flower and the riding back in the dark to make sure I'm home safe. I notice it, and I want you to know that I notice it. I have not said thank you the way I should." "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "I know I don't owe you," Rose said, looking up. "That's why it means something. You don't do it because I owe you. I don't know entirely why you do it, but I know it's not that." Albert looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it's not that." A silence settled, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones before it, less like a wall and more like an open doorway. "My wife's name was Eleanor," Albert said after a moment. "I know," Rose said. "Mabel told me. I'm sorry." He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "She was a good woman. She was brave about everything. When she died," he stopped and started again. "When she died, I thought for a long time that I had used up my share, that I'd had what a person gets and I should be content with what was past and not ask for anything more." He paused. "I have been slowly deciding that I was wrong about that." Rose watched him. "I am not trying to push you toward anything," he said, with the directness that she had come to understand was his way. "I want you to know that I see you who you are, not who I might want you to be, and that I am in no hurry. But I did not want to sit here any longer and let you not know." Rose looked at him for a long moment. The winter light came through the kitchen window and lay flat and gold across the table between them. "I appreciate you saying it plainly," she said finally. "I hoped you would." "I can't promise you anything," she said. "I am not—" She stopped and tried again. I'm not the same as I was when I was young. I don't know how much of what I used to be is still there." "I think it's there," Albert said. "You don't know me well enough to know that." "I know you gentled a horse in 10 minutes that I couldn't get near for 2 days," he said. "I know you fixed your own chimney and rebuilt your front step and rewalled a root cellar and did all of it because you believed it was worth doing well. I know you are the most capable person I have met in a long time." He paused. "I know that behind everything you carry there is someone who is not nearly as hard as she appears." Rose felt something move in her chest, a shift, deep and old like ice at the beginning of a thaw. She pressed it back by reflex, the way she always did, and then stopped pressing. "I need time," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I have time." She believed him, and that the believing him was itself something new. She walked home that afternoon in the cold, clear air, and the world looked, she noticed, slightly different than it had that morning. Not transformed. Not suddenly warm or bright or dramatically altered. Just slightly different. As if a lens she had been looking through for years had shifted fractionally, bringing things she had stopped seeing back into focus. The winter of 1878 settled over the hill country in its particular way. Not savage as it was on the northern plains, but cold enough, with sharp winds off the plateau and ice on the water troughs in the early mornings. Rose kept her fire burning, tended her animals, made soap from the ash and tallow she had been saving, and preserved the last of the fall garden in her newly repaired root cellar. She also continued cooking for the running sea 3 days a week, and the rhythm of that work was different now than it had been before, not because anything overt had changed, but because the air between her and Albert was different. He was still patient. He was still unhurried, but there was now an acknowledged thing between them, small and new and careful, and they were both being careful with it in their different ways. He started saying things during the after-dinner coffee, not big things, but personal things, the way people do when they are letting someone see more of them gradually. He told her about growing up in Virginia, the youngest of 4 brothers, and how he had come west at 19 because he had wanted land of his own and Virginia was used up. He told her about the first 3 years in Texas, the hard years when he had made most of his mistakes and learned what the land required of a person. He told her about Alina carefully, with the respect of someone who knows a subject is tender but believes it should not be avoided, and Rose listened and did not flinch from it. And in return, slowly, she began to speak. Not all at once, not with any dramatic outpouring, but in small portions, a story about her father, a detail about the Kansas homestead, a memory of her brother Thomas that she had not spoken aloud in years. Each time she braced herself for the speaking to hurt more than she could manage, and each time it hurt a normal amount, a bearable amount, and Albert received what she gave without treating it as more than she intended it to be. This was, she was discovering, one of his particular gifts. He did not overdramatize and he did not minimize. He simply received things as they were. One December evening, when she had stayed late because the afternoon had gotten away from them in conversation and the dark came early, Albert walked her to her gate again. They had done this many times, but this time at the gate he stopped and turned to her in the cold dark and said, "Would you walk with me on Sunday? In the afternoon? Just on the land. There's a section of the creek I've been meaning to show you since October." Rose looked at him in the dark. The stars were extraordinary over the hill country, the kind of canopy that always made her feel small but not in an unpleasant way. "Yes," she said. The word came out before the fear did, and she let it stand. They walked on Sunday, in the pale winter sunshine, along the limestone bank of the creek that ran along the southern edge of Albert's property. The creek was full from the autumn rains and ran clear and quick over a bed of white rock, and the cedar and live oak along the banks were dark green against the pale gray sky. There were deer tracks in the mud at the bank, and a great blue heron standing in the shallows like a stone. They did not talk much. They walked and looked at the country, and occasionally one of them said something and the other responded, and the silence between words was easy in a way that Rose found, to her mild surprise, that she had missed without knowing she had missed it, the easy silence of good company. At one point, they came to a wide, flat rock at the creek's edge that Albert had obviously been to before, judging by how naturally he stopped there. Rose sat on the rock and looked at the creek running past, and Albert sat beside her, near but not crowding, and they watched the heron stalk slowly through the shallows. "I have been trying to think of the right word for what this feels like," Rose said, not looking at him, "and I can't find it." "What does it feel like?" Albert asked quietly. She thought for a moment. "Like setting something down," she said. "Something I have been carrying, not setting it all the way down. I don't know if I know how to do that, but slightly, just slightly." Albert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's enough. That's a start." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at the creek with that expression he had, steady and unhurried, a face that had been through its own grief and come out the other side into something that was not innocence but was its own kind of peace. "You have been very patient with me," Rose said. "It hasn't been hard," he said simply. "You're worth being patient with." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she did something she had not done with intention in a very long time. She reached over and put her hand on his where it rested on the rock. Just that, just her hand on his hand. Albert went very still, the way she had been still with the bay horse, giving her every chance to change her mind. She did not change her mind. His hand turned slightly under hers and enclosed it, warm and careful, and they sat like that by the running creek in the December light, and the heron opened its great wings and lifted silently from the water and was gone. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a modest affair, a church service that doubled as a community gathering, a potluck supper in the church hall, paper decorations, and a cedar tree brought in by the Holt brothers. Rose went, which surprised several people who had assumed she was the sort who would avoid community gatherings. She went because Mabel had asked her, and because she had decided, quietly and without ceremony, to begin trying a little harder to be part of the world rather than beside it. Albert was there, standing with Ernesto near the door when she arrived, and when he saw her he broke into a smile that was different from the careful expression she had been seeing all autumn, fuller, less guarded, the smile of a man who has been hoping for something and found it. "Miss Maddox," he said. "Mr. Crawford," she said. And then, because it was Christmas, and because the church hall was warm and smelled of pine, and because she was tired of making things harder than they had to be, she smiled back at him. A real smile, not the polite, contained version she deployed when necessary, but an actual smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Mabel Greer, standing 3 feet away, looked very pleased with herself. They sat together at the supper. They talked with the Holts and with Ernesto and with Pete, who had dressed in a clean shirt for the occasion and looked simultaneously proud and embarrassed by it. They talked with Hector Birch and his wife, and with the new preacher, a young man from Georgia named Reverend Ellis, who was still clearly adjusting to Texas. And through all of it, Rose found that the conversation, the company, the noise and warmth of a room full of people, none of it closed over her the way it usually did. She could breathe in it. She was still herself, still quiet, still more observer than participant in the louder exchanges, but she was present in a way she had not been in a room full of people in a long time. Albert walked her home as he always did, and at her gate he stopped and turned to her and said very quietly, "I have enjoyed today more than any day I can remember in a long time." "So have I," Rose said. He reached out and took her hand, the same way she had taken his at the creek, careful and deliberate. He held it for a moment. "Happy Christmas, Rose," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and it landed differently than anything else had, simple and warm and intimate without being anything that asked her to be different than she was. "Happy Christmas, Albert," she said. She went inside and stood by her fire for a very long time and thought about how the hardness she had carried was not, it turned out, what she was. It was only what she had learned to wear. And underneath it, still alive, was the woman who had run barefoot in Missouri summers and who had loved with a full heart, And she was beginning to understand. Still capable of it, still capable of choosing to be open even knowing what openness cost. Because the alternative, she was finally admitting, also had a cost. A long, slow, quiet cost that she had been paying for years without accounting for it. The new year of 1879 came in on a cold, starry night, and Rose Maddox stood on her front step and listened to the distant sound of the church bell being rung by someone enthusiastic in town, and she felt the year turning, and she was not afraid of it. In January, a problem arrived from outside in the form of a man named Whitfield Crane. Crane was a land speculator who had come through the area before, according to Albert, in the mid-70s, and had not done well by anyone he had dealt with. He had arrived again in Redemption Creek with two men who worked for him and a manner that was all smiles and charm, until you looked at the paperwork he was offering. He was buying up small homesteads, or trying to at prices well below their value, targeting in particular the landowners he assessed as most vulnerable. He came to Rose's gate on a cold Tuesday morning with his hat in his hand and his smile arranged and offered her $600 for her 40 acres and the house she had made on it. Rose looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. Crane's smile adjusted. He began to explain that the offer was generous, given current land values, that the area was difficult, that a woman alone might find the burden. "No," Rose said again, in exactly the same tone. Crane tried several more angles, his voice never losing its surface pleasantness. Rose stood in her doorway and said nothing further, simply waiting for him to finish. When he wound down, she said, "Good day, Mr. Crane," and closed the door. She heard later that he had had more success with some of the other small landholders in the area. The widow Pierce on the South Road had sold her 30 acres under pressure she could not entirely name. And old Martin Selby, who was unwell, had signed something he did not fully understand. Rose was troubled by this in the way she was troubled by injustice generally, with a low, steady anger that was more useful than the hot kind. She walked to the running sea that afternoon and told Albert what had happened. Albert listened without interrupting, and his expression when she finished was that quiet, level sort that she had learned meant he was more concerned than he looked. "He's been to several people," he said. "Ernesto told me this morning that Crane tried to get to Miguel Ramos, who has a small place east of the river. Miguel told him where to go, essentially, but not everyone knows they can do that. He told the widow Pierce that the legal documentation was in order," Rose said, "but I don't think she had anyone look at it before she signed." Albert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a man in San Antonio who is a lawyer. I can write to him and ask him to look at whatever Crane is putting in front of people." "Can we get the widow Pierce's papers reviewed?" Rose asked. "We can try," he said. They sat together at the kitchen table, and Albert wrote the letter that afternoon, and Rose sat across from him and watched him write and thought about the word "we," how naturally it was coming to them both now, and how it did not frighten her the way it once would have. Albert rode into town and wired the lawyer in San Antonio, and within the week word came back that Crane's contracts contained several provisions that were, if not outright illegal, sufficiently misleading that they could be challenged. Albert shared this information with anyone who would listen, and the word spread through the small community in the way that important information spreads in small communities, thoroughly and fast. Crane, who had been counting on isolation and ignorance, found both suddenly unavailable, and within 2 weeks he had packed up his smile and his 2 men and moved on to some other place where the soil was more favorable to his particular kind of agriculture. Rose heard about his departure on a Wednesday morning, and when Albert came into the kitchen for coffee after the noon meal she said, simply, "Good." "Good," Albert agreed. "You wrote the lawyer in the first place," Rose said. "You came to me first," he said. The we of it again. She let herself feel it. February brought the first real warm spell, those fall spring days the hill country gives you in winter, bright and mild, smelling of cedar and warming stone. On a Saturday, Rose was in her kitchen garden turning the soil for spring planting when she became aware that she was humming. She stopped and registered this with the careful attention she had been developing for such moments, the small evidences of something loosening, something returning. She was humming a song her mother had sung, a hymn with a long, sweeping line that Rose had loved as a child. She stood in the winter-warm garden with a spade in her hand and let herself hum it all the way through, and the morning was very quiet and the soil was rich and dark, and she thought, I am all right. And then, more carefully, I could be more than all right. Albert came by that afternoon with a small thing, a cutting from a rosebush he had found growing wild along the creek bank, carried in a tin can of wet soil. He was slightly self-conscious about it in a way that Rose found touching without being willing to say so. I thought you might want it for the garden, he said. It was growing wild on the south bank of the creek. Probably a long time ago it was someone's cultivated rose that naturalized. The blooms are dark red. Rose took the tin from him and looked at the cutting, a short woody stem with the beginnings of new leaves. Thank you, she said, and meant it without qualification. He looked at her in the afternoon light. You look different, he said. Different how? He considered this with his usual care. Lighter, he said. I don't mean physically, I mean he stopped. I know what you mean, Rose said. She planted the rosebush cutting at the corner of the garden where it would get the most light, and she pressed the soil around it with her hands, and she thought about dark red roses growing in Texas hill country, and about the strange paths that bring a thing from somewhere it began to somewhere it belongs. Spring came in earnest in March, the live oaks putting out their soft new leaves, the bluebonnets appearing along the roadsides in spreading pools of blue that made Rose stop her horse whenever she passed them and simply look. She had a habit now of looking at things she had stopped looking at, and it was still sometimes startling, the way the world contained so much if you let yourself see it. She and Albert had been to church together twice, which in a town the size of Redemption Creek meant that everyone had an opinion. Rose was aware of the opinions and was, mostly, indifferent to them. Mabel had appointed herself a kind of cheerful champion, and quelled any commentary in her vicinity with the efficient authority of a woman who has strong feelings about things that are none of anyone else's business. One afternoon in late March, Albert came to Rose's gate and stood there with his hat in his hands in the way he had on that very first morning he had offered to help with the fence, and she came to the gate and looked at him. I have something I want to say, he said. Then say it, she said, which was not the gentle thing but it was the honest thing, and he had always responded to honest things. He said, I love you, Rose. I have loved you for some time. I am not asking you for anything today that you're not ready to give, but I wanted you to know it plainly, because I think you deserve plain things. Rose looked at him. She thought about Daniel and about Alina and about all the losses they had both carried. She thought about the rose cutting growing in the corner of her garden. She thought about walking along the creek in December with her hand in his. She thought about the woman who had been buried under years of careful keeping, and how this man had waited at the gate of her, patient as water-wearing stone, never demanding entry, never withdrawing either, simply present, simply steady, simply there. I love you too, she said. She had thought it would be harder to say. She had expected the words to resist, to catch in her throat the way things do when you have held them back for a long time. But they came out clearly in her own voice, with the simple certainty of something that had been true for a while and was only now being named. Albert looked at her, and the expression that had been behind his eyes all these months, the careful, hopeful, patient thing, came fully to the surface. Can I come through the gate? He said. Yes, she said, and opened it. He came through the gate and stood before her in the spring morning, and he took her hands in both of his, and they stood like that in the front yard of the limestone house she had built into a home, and there were bluebonnets blooming in the long grass at the garden's edge, and the air smelled of cedar and rain and new soil, and Rose Maddox felt, for the first time in years, that she was standing in the right place. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, and she closed her eyes, and the world was very quiet and very good. There was a great deal to decide and very little to rush, and they went about it the way they went about everything carefully, practically, with honesty applied to the hard questions. The hard questions were real ones. Rose was not willing to give up her land. She had earned it in a way that went beyond money, and it was hers in a way that she could not fully articulate but that Albert understood without needing it articulated. They talked about this at length, and Albert said that he had no intention or desire to ask her to give it up, that her 40 acres bordering his land made every kind of sense to keep, that she should keep it in her name. "Are you sure?" she asked, because the laws of 1879 Texas were not in women's favor where property was concerned, and she wanted to be clear-eyed. "I'm sure," he said, and he was looking at her with that steady regard that she had come to understand was not just feeling but also intention. "What is yours. I would not want it any other way." She believed him because she had spent enough time watching him be exactly who he said he was. They also talked about the past. Really talked about it, in the way you can when you have both been patient enough to earn the right. Rose told him about Daniel, not just the loss of him but about the marriage itself, the young woman she had been, the hope she had carried west and the grief she had carried back from it. Albert listened and did not try to fix it or minimize it. And then he told her about Alina, about the pregnancy and the terrible winter of 1874, about the man he had been in the year after, and the slow, unglamorous business of becoming someone he could live with again. "She would have liked you," Albert said. "Alina, she liked people who did not waste words." Rose was quiet for a moment, feeling the strange tenderness of this. "That's a kind thing to say." "It's true," he said simply. They were married in May of 1879, on a bright Saturday morning at the Redemption Creek Church, with Reverend Ellis presiding and most of the town present, because in a town that size there are no private events. Mabel Greer had appointed herself the primary arranger of the occasion, and had done so with the particular efficiency of a woman who is magnificent in her element. The church was hung with garlands of wildflowers, bluebonnets, an Indian paintbrush, and black-eyed Susans, and the potluck supper afterward in the church hall was a genuine community gathering of the kind that frontier towns are good at when they try. Rose wore a dress she and Mabel had made together over the previous weeks, a practical deep blue cotton, nothing elaborate, with good seams and a collar she liked. She wore her hair down for the first time in recent memory, and when she came into the church and Albert turned from the front and saw her, he looked at her with an expression that she carried with her for years after, that open, unguarded thing, like a man who has been waiting for something and has stopped being surprised that it arrived. Pete Sutter, standing with the ranch hands in the second pew, had to be nudged by Carl Holt to stop staring. Ernesto stood with his arms folded and his expression grave and solemn, which for Ernesto was the equivalent of weeping openly with joy. Rose stood at the front of the church beside Albert Crawford and said the words she meant, and he said the words he meant, and Reverend Ellis said what Reverend Ellises say, and Mabel in the front pew pressed a handkerchief to her eyes with both satisfaction and delight. Then it was done. They were married. The summer of 1879 was a revelation to Rose, not because it was easy. It was not always easy, but because it was real, and she was present in it in a way she had not been present in anything for a long time. She kept her own land as they had agreed, and she also became the true partner of the running sea, not in any formal or legally acknowledged way that the era would have supported, but in practice. She knew the accounts, she knew the cattle, she knew the hands and their strengths and where they needed managing. Albert consulted her on every significant decision and acted on her counsel when it was sound, which was most of the time. She also continued to cook, because she was good at it, and because she found that feeding people was, for her, a form of care that she had room for now. She fed the hands and she fed her husband and she fed the occasional neighbor who came by, and she found that she was, for the first time in years, genuinely glad when people came through the gate. The rose cutting she had planted in the spring bloomed for the first time in June, exactly as Albert had predicted, dark red blooms, deep and fragrant, climbing the corner of the garden fence. Rose stood and looked at them for a long time the first morning they opened. Albert came up beside her and looked at them too. "I found them by the creek because of the color," he said. "I thought of you." "Of me," she said, looking at the roses. "You always wore that blue dress when you came over in the beginning," he said, "and the roses were almost exactly the same color as your eyes when you were telling me plainly that you did not need my help." Rose laughed, a full laugh, the kind she had been rediscovering, the kind that surprised even her sometimes with its presence. "My eyes are brown," she said. "In certain lights they are dark red," he said, and the absolute sincerity of it made her laugh again, and he looked at her laughing and smiled his full smile and put his arm around her shoulders. They stood together looking at the dark red roses in the June morning, and Rose Maddox, who was Rose Crawford now and who was, she had decided, both things simultaneously, felt the weight that she had carried for so many years not gone, not pretended away, but lighter. Genuinely, substantially lighter. Because the weight of grief does not vanish when a person learns to live again, but it changes nature. It stops being the whole thing and becomes instead only a part of the thing, held alongside the rest. She was in her early months of pregnancy by August, which she had suspected for several weeks before she was entirely certain, and then was entirely certain. She told Albert on a Wednesday evening after supper, sitting on the front step of the limestone house in the warm summer dark. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, watching him as she said it. Albert Crawford sat very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and his face was doing something she had not seen on it before, a complex, moving thing, the mixture of an old grief being touched again and a new hope arriving at the same time in the same place, which is one of the more complicated weathers a human face can carry. "Rose," he said, and then said nothing more for a moment. "I know it is complicated for you," she said quietly. "I know it touches something painful." "Yes," he said, "and yes to the other thing too, both things at once." She took his hand. "Both things at once," she agreed. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it for a moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you afraid?" "A little," she said. "The ordinary amount." "Good," he said. "Then I'll be afraid the ordinary amount too, and we'll do it together." She leaned against him in the warm dark, and the nightjars were calling from the cedar brakes, and the stars were coming out one by one over the hill country, and Rose Maddox thought with a clarity that surprised her that she was happy. Not the guarded contentment she had accepted as the substitute, not the manageable okay she had maintained through the hard years, but genuinely, quietly, sustainedly happy in the way that happiness works when it is the real thing, not as an absence of difficulty, but as something that persists alongside the difficulty and is not defeated by it. The pregnancy progressed well through the fall. Mabel Greer appointed herself helpful in the practical and non-negotiable way she applied to everything, and the midwife in town, a capable woman named Mrs. Osgood, who had attended 100 births in the territory, came by monthly and pronounced everything as it should be. Albert hovered at a respectful and slightly anxious distance that Rose found more endearing than she felt comfortable admitting. She was delivered, in a cold night in December of 1879, of a healthy boy. He was a big, indignant baby who came into the world with the full force of his opinions about the matter, and then, once settled against his mother's chest, went suddenly and completely calm, his dark eyes searching the face above him with an expression of grave, careful attention that made Albert, standing at the bedside, put both hands over his mouth. "He looks like you," Rose said, looking down at the baby. "He looks furious," Albert said, which made Mrs. Osgood laugh and made Rose smile at the ceiling. "What do you want to call him?" Rose asked. Albert was quiet for a moment, looking at his son. "Thomas," he said, "if you're willing." Rose looked at him, and the name landed exactly where she knew he had intended it, over an old sorrow, gently like a hand placed on something that has been hurting. Her brother Thomas, who had died in that Kansas winter, a name carried forward. Thomas, she said. Yes. Thomas James Crawford was, from his first days, a substantial and cheerful presence in the world. He was also, as he grew through the first months of 1880, demonstrably his father's son in the particular quality of his attention. He would fix on things with those gray-green eyes and simply watch them, methodically and without hurry, until he understood them. Rose watched this and thought, that patience, he learned it from somewhere. She thought also about the particular mercy of a child who arrives and becomes not a replacement for what was lost, but something entirely new, its own life, filling its own space, not asking to be what it is not. By the spring of 1880, Redemption Creek had a small school operating full-time in a building the community had put up over the winter, and Rose, who had strong feelings about education, was one of the people who had pushed hardest for it. The school was staffed by a young woman from Austin named Miss Clara Webb, who was 23 and very earnest, and who became one of the few people Rose regarded with the warmth she had once reserved only for family. Pete Sutter, who had been working for Albert since he had shown up hungry at the gate 2 years prior, had grown into a capable young man of 19, and he was, it turned out, intensely interested in Miss Clara Webb, a fact that was evident to everyone in Redemption Creek except, apparently, Pete himself, who stood in Miss Webb's presence looking like he had forgotten how words were organized. Rose watched this with an amusement she had not expected to feel, and told Albert about it one evening in the way that married people tell each other the small observed things of their days. He was standing in front of the school this afternoon with his hat in his hands, Rose said, turning it in a circle. Albert was quiet for a moment. That sounds familiar, he said. Rose looked at him. The hat, he said mildly. Rose thought about Albert Crawford standing at her fence on that first morning with his hat in his hands, and at her gate the day of the fence offer, and on the day he had told her he loved her. She looked at her husband. Pete is going to be all right, she said. He is, Albert agreed. He just needs time. Some people, Rose said carefully looking at him, need someone who is patient enough to give it. Albert looked back at her with his full, steady regard, and the corners of his eyes creased in the way she had come to love without reservation. Some people are worth waiting for, he said. She put Thomas down for his nap, and they sat together on the front step of the limestone house in the spring evening, and the roses were putting out new growth at the corner of the garden, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, a slow, peaceful sound, and the hill country rolled away in every direction under the wide Texas sky. Rose thought about the woman who had ridden into Redemption Creek 2 years ago with a Winchester across her saddle horn and an expression that made men step off the boardwalk. She thought about how that woman had been protecting something real, something that had been hurt and needed protecting, and she did not fault her for it. The hardness had been necessary once. It had kept her whole when she might otherwise have been broken. But it had stayed past its necessary time, and she had worn it so long she had nearly forgotten what was underneath. What was underneath was this. This house, this man, this child sleeping inside, this garden with its dark red roses, this life that was genuinely and unreservedly hers. What was underneath was the woman who could still learn to trust the world again, who could still learn to let someone in without losing herself, who could still choose the hard and hopeful thing over the safe and closed thing, even after everything she had known about what hope costs. What was underneath had always been worth protecting. It was also, she had learned, worth finally, carefully, deliberately letting live. Redemption Creek in the spring of 1880 was a town with a school and a church and a growing water supply and a small but real civic life. And it sat in the hill country of Texas in the golden, ordinary, irreplaceable way of places that have been made by people who intended to stay. The bluebonnets bloomed along every road and the creek ran clear, and the cattle grazed on the long grass, and the children would soon have somewhere to learn. And all of it was impermanent in the way everything is impermanent, and also in the way everything also is, entirely and beautifully present. Rose Crawford, who had once been Rose Maddox and was still Rose Maddox, both and always, sat in the evening light with her husband beside her and her son asleep inside, and she felt the ordinary beauty of it without qualification. She was not the same woman who had ridden in from Abilene. She was more, and she was more honestly herself, and the hardness she had worn, that long, necessary, costly armor, had not been abandoned so much as transformed, turned from a wall into something more like a foundation, the knowledge of what she had survived giving ground to the life she was building on top of it. Albert put his arm around her shoulders, the easy, familiar weight of it, and she leaned into him, the easy, familiar certainty of it, and they watched the evening come in over the hill country, the sky going from gold to amber to the deep blue of a Texas dusk. "What are you thinking?" he asked, the way he asked sometimes, not as a demand but as a genuine invitation. Rose thought about this. "That I'm glad I stopped waiting to be less afraid," she said finally, "and that I'm glad you were there when I did." He pressed his lips to her temple. "I was always going to be there," he said. She believed him. Thomas would have a sister in 2 years' time, a girl they would name Clara after the teacher, in the particular way frontier communities honored the people who shaped them. And Clara Crawford would grow up running barefoot through the hill country summers in a way that would make Rose think of Missouri and of herself at 12. And the circle of it would be one of the quiet graces of a life that had plenty of them, once she stopped closing her eyes to them. Ernesto would stay at the Running Sea for another 15 years, until his retirement, and would be regarded by everyone as something between an employee and a founding member of the family. The Holt brothers would eventually move on, Wallace to New Mexico, Carl to California, but they would come back for Thomas's first birthday and write letters for years after. Pete Sutter would marry Clara Webb in the summer of 1881, nervously and joyfully, and Rose would stand at the back of the church and feel something warm and large in her chest that she did not bother to press down. Albert Crawford would, over the years, repoint the chimney on the main house, build a larger barn, add a wing to the limestone house when the family needed the room, and become the kind of man a community leans on not because he sought it, but because he was simply, reliably there. He would age in the particular way of men who work outdoors and live genuinely slowly, with increasing solidity, the gray coming into his dark hair, and the lines deepening at the corners of those gray-green eyes. He would remain patient in the way that was not passivity, but was instead a deep and considered kindness, a choosing every day to meet the people he loved where they were rather than where he wished they were. And Rose would love him for it, more each year, in the way that love works when it has been built on honest ground, not diminishing with familiarity but deepening, becoming more rather than less as the years laid down their layers, until the love was part of the landscape itself, as much a feature of the hill country as the limestone bluffs and the dark red roses growing at the corner of the garden. She would think sometimes about the woman she had been riding into Redemption Creek in the summer of 1878, and she would not be ashamed of her. That woman had done what she needed to do to survive, and survival is not a small thing, and the hardness she had worn was not a failure of character, but a proof of it, proof that she had refused to be defeated even when defeat would have been understandable. But she was glad, genuinely and without reservation, that she had let it go, that she had been patient enough with herself to let the thaw come when it came, and that she had found, waiting quietly at her gate, a man who had been patient enough to wait for it. The roses bloomed dark red every June, and the creek ran clear over white limestone, and the hill country rolled in every direction under the enormous Texas sky, and Rose Crawford stood in the garden of the life she had chosen and felt, entirely and without apology, the full weight of her own happiness. She was home. She was herself. She was loved and she was loving, and all of it was real and all of it was hers.